Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Ryuichi Sakamoto, 12. Okay then, I feel like this has been an especially long time coming. Ryuichi Sakamoto is an electronic artist and classical composer who's been working since the 70s, and is probably best known for being part of the pioneering synth pop outfit Yellow Magic Orchestra, alongside Hiromi Hosono and Yukihiro Takahashi, well known as basically being the Japanese equivalent to Kraftwerk, and probably the last of the really big, obvious synth pioneer outfits that I have yet to mention or talk about on this channel. Given what this channel is all about, I can't very well skip over this obvious opportunity to go into them more in depth. I'll admit that while I've known about Sakamoto and YMO for several years, the only YMO-related material that I'd actually listened to before making this video was Orbital's remix of Behind the Mask. Yeah, I'd been interested in looking into the greater catalogs of either YMO or just Sakamoto's own solo material for a long time and just never got around to it. There's never been a good enough opportunity, or at least not one that I was actively paying attention to. YMO stopped putting out new music together in the 90s, and Yukihiro Takahashi just passed away earlier this year, RIP. So it's not like I could just wait around for a comeback album to cover them. I'd have to be paying attention to their solo work instead. Well, with Sakamoto having the most well-publicized solo career of the YMO members, I'd been watching out for a new studio album of his on and off for the past 4 years or so. Not as much the other two guys who also have massive solo back catalogs of their own and probably provided me with a couple of other opportunities that I missed, but I guess it is what it is. Still, with this latest solo album of his dropping a couple of weeks ago, I figured this was the perfect time for me to finally catch myself up. Now, be warned, this may or may not be topping Klaus Schultz for the longest and brief segment I will have ever done on this channel, because, technically, I'm going to be doing two of them. First, I'm going to go through the 8 studio albums from YMO, because I fairly frequently get requests to talk about them, and I don't feel like I'm going to get another more fitting opportunity for that. And then I'll be talking about Sakamoto's solo material, which I believe he has 19 solo studio albums by my count, and that's still missing out on huge chunks of his catalog. I won't be talking about his collaboration albums with other artists, with one exception I'll get to, just focusing on the music he's done on his own. He's also done a gazillion soundtrack and score albums, which I'll mostly be skipping over as well, with the exceptions of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and The Last Emperor, which I got the feeling might be too important to his history to ignore. And I'm also skipping over his live albums and albums such as 1996, Playing the Piano, or 3, which are all just piano versions of various old previously released material. He's got a surprising amount of those. And that's not even getting into how a lot of these projects have several different versions to choose from, with some even getting whole different track listings in Japan and in the rest of the world. I think for most of the stuff that was released in the 70s and earlier 80s, I think I stuck to the original Japanese versions, and then the later stuff I tended to stick to the international versions, but yeah. Anyway, we got an absolute ton to get through, so strap in, folks. First, here's my thoughts on the Yellow Magic Orchestra discography. So, I can pinpoint the exact moment I got the hype for this band, and it was about half a second of the opening track, Firecracker. This was great right off the bat. Super bright and cheerful, mostly instrumental synth pop and electro disco that's instantly likable. Actually much closer to Giorgio Moroder than Kraftwerk. Also with some fairly stereotypical Japanese flares to some of the melodies, obviously. The second side of this thing is also much stronger than the already fairly solid first side. I like how all those tracks start to directly segue and link into each other, a la Giorgio's From Here to Eternity. Love this whole thing. But this is, of course, the big obvious classic that everyone always highlights as their best work and the best starting point to get into them. And I pretty much agree with the hype on this one, too. It's got all the same strengths as the self-titled, while not being nearly as much as a cheesy novelty, I guess. More focused on sounding sleek and futuristic, perhaps aside from the strange cover of the Beatles' Day Tripper. I don't know if I actually like this more than the self-titled, but they're on par with each other. I think the self-titled had higher high points, while this is more consistent. Both great and totally lived up to the hype, though. What? A comedy album? Sure. So the most obvious thing to note about this one is the fact that half the track listing is not even music at all, but spoken comedy sketches. Half of them in English and half of them in Japanese, and they take up just as much of the running time as the actual music. I didn't laugh at any of the English skits, but I didn't cringe at them either. They're predictably awkward, but probably more thanks to the language barrier, and I think they're making fun of, like, rich people and racists, which, no problem with that. Ironically, I think I was cringing a lot more at the actual music, which is also going for a more comedic tone and trying at some rock and funk influences, which do not really go over well. I could not get behind the yelpy vocals on Tighten Up or its pointless reprise, and the freaking track about She's at a Nice Age, oh my god. This album does have its fans. If you mess with it or find the humor to land for you, that's great, but this one's a skip if you ask me. Okay, we're getting back on track now. The sound's starting to get a lot more overtly 80s in the particular style of Phil Collins percussion and a bunch of TR-808s too. They're incorporating the burgeoning electro style into their sound before Cybotron came along and perfected it, and even trying their hand a little bit at this newfangled phenomenon of rap music, which is actually not nearly as embarrassing as you'd think it'd be. Their take on rap sounds more like a less serious Cabaret Voltaire's The Crackdown. Not quite as stellar as the first two, and still not crazy about the singing, but it's still an all-around fun time. Okay, this one's a keeper, and it works on totally different merits from the first two albums, doubling down on the electro style they'd started moving in with the last album, and doing it even better, getting markedly more stripped back and experimental with a lot of cool uses of samples and stutter edits that maybe sort of call Jean-Michel Jarre's look to mind a little bit, 5 years before he'd tried out those techniques. And while the singing is not better than it was before, it feels like it fits better for this particular kind of style. Great stuff. Next up, we got their most traditional and straightforward pop record to date. Seems like they're pretending to be some kind of J-pop boy band as a joke, but it's actually pretty credible for what it is and features easily the best singing on any of their albums. Not as well varied as their best work, but it's another solid effort for sure. Oh great, another album where half the track listing is comedy sketches, and all the sketches are in Japanese, and they're really long too. Great, exactly what I wanted. At least the actual music is better than Multiplies, pretty much just continues off the style from their last album and does it about equally as well. Bit of an underwhelming finish to this band's run before they broke up, but it's still generally fine. Sakamoto delivered two really solid ballads in Shadows on the Ground and Perspective that I really liked. Although they did also reform to put out one last comeback record a decade later, and this is a more of a dignified send-off to the band, if admittedly not among the most interesting work they've ever done, combining their usual style with some fairly standard 90s ambient techno arrangements and resulting in a listen that is front to back very pleasant and nails down a solid vibe, if maybe falling into the background a bit. Got all that? Good. Now on to the more relevant part of the video. Here's my thoughts on most of Sakamoto's solo discography so far. Alright, so we're starting in 1978 with an album that predates YMO self-titled by a month, though both of the other two guys in YMO are also credited with helping out in minor roles, alongside a number of other guest musicians. Sonically, it's not too far away from those first two YMO albums, sticking to a similar palette of easily accessible electronic textures and some occasional traditional Japanese flares to the melodies, but the compositions here are way longer and more open-ended, like those you'd hear from his Berlin School contemporaries like Tangerine Dream or Klaus Schulze and all those. Occasionally getting a bit more openly experimental, and including some modern classical elements as seen on a 5-minute piano piece, Grasshoppers. Gee, I wonder if that's going to become a trend later in his catalog. But yeah, this was a keeper for sure. Just a lovely listen all around, and obviously worth hearing for anyone with passing interest in the 70s synth pioneers. Damn, this is almost like a straightforward Detroit techno record before Detroit techno was even a thing. Lots of stiff drum machine beats, experimental synth textures, and a few sparse minimalistic melodies that show a fair bit of influence from the EBM and industrial scenes starting to gain traction at the time. If I didn't know any better, I'd have guessed this was released in 1993 and not 1980. Now, I will also have to admit that I didn't find this to be the most engaging listen by today's standards. I put this one on like 4 times in a row trying to get it to click with me deeper, and it kept falling into the background without leaving as much of an impact as I hoped. But I can at least really respect all of it. It's certainly proof of how creative and forward-thinking he could be. This one also has a fairly stripped back and minimal sound palette, but focuses on a more accessible and melodic approach that also brings back a lot of the traditional Japanese flares and the melodies again. Features more of Sakamoto's own singing and includes what sounds like some early versions of MIDI programming. Also, Adrian Belew contributed to a few tracks, which is neat. Don't know if I precisely found it mind-blowing myself, but it was all around a solid, very pleasant listen. I am again mostly skipping over soundtracks in this roundup, but this soundtrack is arguably Sakamoto's single most well-known solo work overall, so it wouldn't have felt right to skip over it. Sakamoto stars in the movie himself, alongside David Bowie of all people. I have not actually seen the movie. There was also an entire piano cover album of this soundtrack he released around the same time called Coda, which is sometimes classified as one of his main albums, but I didn't, obviously. And Sakamoto's performed like a gazillion cover versions of the title track over the years. But the soundtrack album itself also holds up as a standalone experience in its own right. A lot of very sparse and minimal ambient synth compositions with some occasional piano and orchestral touches, all delivering the right emotional resonance you'd want out of this kind of material, and it's even decently well varied. I was surprised by how consistently engaged I was by the whole thing. I'd say it's worth checking out. Okay, this is definitely my favorite album of his since Thousand Knives. He's combining his mid-80s instrumental synth-pop style with lots of other elements from other genres. Jazz, classical, dub reggae, funk, world music elements, experimental elements. It's all really well varied, and each track is consistently engaging while still always feeling like they fit together. Also worth noting that this is a particularly strange case in which the European and Japanese versions have completely different track listings. I stuck to the Japanese version, Ongaku Zukan, since its track listing is longer and better fleshed out, but the European version, Illustrated Musical Encyclopedia, totally shifts around the sequencing, and has two exclusive tracks called Fieldwork and Steppin' Into Asia, which are both absolutely worth seeking out on their own. The former features a guest appearance from Thomas Dolby of all people, and I believe the latter has vocals from his either future wife or then wife, Akiko Yano. And this is his most experimental work up to this point, a lot of very formless and abstract glitch work with lots of rapidly chopped up samples of various instruments. Not really forming coherent grooves or tunes, but there is a cool, like, jittery and esoteric atmosphere to it, and it's not like melodies are ditched altogether. It's a pretty fascinating listen. If you're a fan of, like, the weirder parts of Brian Eno and David Byrne's My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, or heck, if you're a fan of Wonder Tricks Point Never, or stuff like that, it'll be worth hearing. It does strike me as a little bit ironic that an album called Futurista is actually his most dated and unignorably 80s up to this point, but it's not dated in a bad way. The sound of this one reminds me of stuff coming from outfits like Yellow and The Art of Noise, and you will still get a trip through some accessible and punchy synth pop, as well as some weirder and more experimental moments, including some detours into industrial grooves and other moments with opera singers. It's pretty neat. This is another one kind of like Ongaku Zukan, where it's 80s grooves combined with a lot of different influences from music around the world. Not just all the obvious traditional Japanese sounds, but also some gamelan and maybe some African influences thrown in there too, some more jazz. Not to mention the bass lines are getting a lot funkier, care of Bootsy Collins. And there's a guest vocal appearance from Iggy Pop. Oh, and the whole thing was co-produced by Bill Laswell. And if you're even slightly familiar with Bill Laswell's work, that'll be the least surprising thing in the world. This totally follows his punchy but esoteric production style to a T. Not gonna say I was absolutely floored by this, but it was plenty of fun. Enjoyed it about as much as Futurista. And this is the other soundtrack I felt like I should mention, if only because Sakamoto won an Oscar for it, alongside David Byrne and Kong Su. It sounds like pretty much exactly like what you'd expect out of the soundtrack to a Best Picture winning movie about the last emperor of China. Not really much synths, but a lot of grander orchestral compositions, with Sakamoto providing the more authentic Japanese flares to everything. For this movie set in China, I'm not gonna pretend I know the difference myself. It seems to basically be the equivalent to his catalog what the 1492 soundtrack is to Vangelis's catalog. Also need to hear the subtle but noticeable differences between Sakamoto and Byrne's approaches to writing the exact same kinds of compositions. Sakamoto's pieces are better. Okay, back to the wildly varied World Fusion albums. This feels like an even further expansion on the ideas he explored on Neo Geo, with even more clean and polished production, even more variety in terms of the instrumentation and amount of influences, also now extending out to India and the Caribbean, among others. and with even more guest appearances. For example, some backup vocals from Brian Wilson on 2 tracks. Though, something wasn't hitting quite right about this one for me. It might have felt a bit too well polished to the point of feeling gentrified. Some of the world music influences could come off cliched, and having to find space next to trendy electro-funk cuts like You Do Me kinda cheapened their effect. Some of the guest vocals, especially the contributions of Arto Lindsay, felt kinda out of place. That guy doing a white boy rap over some shuffling mixes of dub synths and Indian violins isn't really my idea of a great time. I still see a lot of glowing reviews for this one, so maybe this is just a me problem, but I wouldn't put it among his best. Okay, first album in the 90s, and even if this is roughly as well polished and commercial as the last album, I do think it is a significant bounce back. And that may primarily just be my having way more of a stomach for early 90s cliches than late 80s cliches, but I do quite like this one's eclectic mix of house, grooving down-tempo, and a bit of breakbeat, with a whole bunch of laid-back, jazzier tones. Even some hip-hop influences which fit better than you'd expect. Only got Toate and DJ Dimitri from D-Light on a couple of tracks here, which might give you a bit of an idea of the general tone he was going for. I fuck with it. Pretty much just a repeat of the last album, might have more breakbeats this time around, guest appearances from the lead singers of Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Aztec Camera, an appearance from David Byrne on the Japanese version, and even more Toate credits behind the scenes, but other than that, it's the same album again. At least it's roughly equal in terms of personal enjoyment, though. Kinda like the last 2 albums, but a lot less focused on guest features and a lot more focused on classical influenced compositions and Sakamoto's own vocal performances, still being filtered through the same brighter blends of mid-90s pop-friendly jazzy downtempo with some bossa nova influence. Enjoyed it about as much as his last effort. Got conflicting sources on whether this counts as a live album or a studio album, but given all the material here is original, I figured it was worth including in the marathon. Anyway, Sakamoto made a symphony, a full-on orchestral suite split into 4 movements called Grief, Anger, Prayer, and Salvation, all more or less conveying the kinds of emotions their titles imply, with the last movement containing a bunch of spoken word elements. It's nice. And speaking of classical, he decided to double down on that and create an entire solo piano album, which sounds exactly like what you'd expect. A lot of very emotionally resonant and well-crafted, warm but melancholy piano pieces, and that's it, nothing really else to say. I have heard solo piano albums that have been better able to keep my attention through their whole running time. This one ran on a bit long, but I still generally enjoyed all of it for what it was. The best part was when he covered Tong Poo from the YMO self-titled, and since there was like a really noticeable jump in energy there. Next up, moving into the 2000s, starting with an ambient project with nothing but tranquil synth pads and pianos, originally created as a musical journal for him after he'd witnessed 9/11 from his home in New York. It's very straightforward and absolutely nothing revolutionary, but kept me surprisingly engaged with how subtly but noticeably distinct each piece is and how well they fit together. And in the same year, he put out another album which was inspired by his visits to Kenya to learn about human history, supposedly for some kind of documentary according to his website, but I don't know if that ever got released. But yeah, it's an experimental ambient record that incorporates a lot of African elements, switching off between really stripped back ambient pieces, adding some African instrumentation to his synths and pianos, and a couple more up-tempo dance-centric cuts that feature African choruses and chanting and that kind of thing. It's all very pleasant, respectable stuff. If you particularly liked Jean-Michel Jarre's more recent Amazonia projects, this might be worth going back to seek out as well. But okay, if you were missing Sakamoto's more experimental edges, this album brought them back in a big way, combining some more of the same ambient and classical piano touches from his other albums in this era with a whole bunch of abstract, glitch, IDM, and even mild noise elements, and another stacked list of collaborators. Vocal appearances from David Sylvian again. Didn't realize I'd already heard this album's big single World Citizen years ago through a DJ mix by Hybrid. There's also a Korean rapper, MC Sniper, on one track, a few minor co-productions and session performances from Cornelius and Ryoji Ikeda, and some co-production from his old bandmates from YMO working under the name Sketch Show. This was easily one of his best albums in a long time. Tons of creative ideas and executions all throughout, and all presented in a front-to-back engaging way. This was great. Okay, I got another minimal ambient record, kind of like Comica, but more expansive and fleshed out, starting out in kind of in his typical modern classical territory with a few pieces that are focused on like just one instrument, like piano or violin or guitar. But as the album stretches on, you start to run into some stranger and more experimental cuts that manipulate field recordings or process those minimalistic instrumental performances in interesting ways. Again, probably nothing that's gonna change your life, but it does have like a couple of maybe isolated moments of greatness, especially in the second half. And okay, quick digression. I guess I lied about not talking about his collaboration work. I haven't heard any of Sakamoto's other collab albums with other artists like Fenez, Christopher Willits, Moreland Squared, or any number of others. But curiosity got the better of me when it came to this particularly well-acclaimed series of projects he did with Alva Noto throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, collectively known as the Virus series, comprising 4 full albums and 1 EP, whose first letters all spell out the word virus. Vryun, Insen, Revep, UTP, and Sumvs. I decided to check them out on a whim based on how much attention they get in IDM and adjacent circles, and as it turns out, I'm glad I did. Sakamoto hands over his piano performances to Alva Noto, who does a lot of glitch and microprocessing work with them, and the result is a lot of very pretty, tactile, and consistently engaging minimal abstract work that lives up to the aesthetic of the album covers. There's not a ton of variation across the series, and it's probably not going to be for everyone. But there is a lot of cool stuff here. Revep has a cool off-the-wall remix of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Sumvs had 2 similarly neat covers of Brian Eno's By This River. UTP shakes up the formula a bit by adding in an orchestra, care of Ensemble Modern, and utilizes them in some creative ways that still fit with the whole minimal aesthetic. The whole series is really nice, and definitely worth hearing if you're into this particular kind of thing. And finally, the 2010s decade, in which he technically only released this one proper solo studio album here. Most of his work in the 2010s was soundtracks and collabs and other stuff that wasn't new original solo studio material like this, but he finally got inspired to put this together after being diagnosed with throat cancer and recovering from it. And it's in kind of a similar minimalistic ambient lane to Out of Noise, but getting even markedly more out of the box with its ideas. Incorporating more synths and glitches and processing and unconventional techniques to composition and instrumental performances. Spoken word pieces directly musing on the impermanence of life itself. A track of frantic experimental string performances, followed by a track of solo triangle. It's a very strange album, but an exceptionally deep one as well that's surprisingly easy to listen to and connect with. This one honestly really got to me, and I'd absolutely put it among his very best work. Retrospectively could have been a year-end list contender for 2017 if I had been paying attention. Which finally brings us to here. I think you can see why working on this video was the impetus for me to go back through all my old videos and directly label the ones with these in brief segments as having a catalog in brief in their titles. With how ridiculous the percentage of a given video these marathons have taken up, especially in the past couple of years, I feel like I really should have been warning people what they're getting into this whole time. Especially when it comes to an artist like Sakamoto, who's been regularly at it since the late 70s, and my typical format requires me to go off for like 5 times as long as I'll actually be talking about the new album. And yeah, sure enough, this latest album, 12, isn't exactly one that gives me a lot to break down or talk about. It may not surprise you to hear that this is yet another very minimalistic ambient release, but there's definitely a specific kind of weight behind this one that makes it all the more worth highlighting in a proper video like this. I may have mentioned before that Sakamoto may have recovered from throat cancer before, but in 2021 he was diagnosed with rectal cancer, and in 2022 he revealed that said cancer had escalated to stage 4. After getting back from an operation one day, he found himself wanting to play something on the synthesizer. Not necessarily to compose anything specific, he just needed some music around him to help him feel better. He just wanted to shower himself in sound, as he put it. Thus began a new ritual for him over the past couple of years, where he was recording various synth and piano sketches as a sort of musical diary, eventually selecting 12 of his favorite sketches to include in this release, each one named after the date he recorded it. thus creating an album which is more or less designed to directly confront his own mortality, even more so than Async did, even further given way thanks to its release coincidentally happening to coincide with Yukihiro Takahashi's passing. It is a remarkably heavy listen given all that context which can't be ignored given several tracks include the sound of Sakamoto's own breathing in the background and you can already hear he's having a hard time. But at the same time, it's also remarkably light. These were pieces which he intended to make himself feel better, and perhaps ease the pain he was going through, and as such, most of these are very pleasant and comforting. Such is especially the case with most of the tracks in the beginning of the album, the icy high-pitched piano excursions of tracks 2 through 4, which just seem to plink along in a giant sea of reverb, and the light ambient pads of the opener contrasting with the darker and bassier tones of the pads on track 5. That said, I feel like this album really starts to further pick up for me in its second half. Track 6 was probably my favorite out of the looser piano improvisations as it builds around repeating 4-note phrases with a few little blocks of deeper harmony, and track 7 is my favorite of the synth excursions, which felt like they were getting ever so slightly more complex, or at the very least taking up more of the frequency spectrum, using up bassier and mid-range and higher pitch tones in its pads, floating between them to a pretty engaging degree. But after this point, in the last leg of the album, the piano pieces start to feel markedly more intentionally structured and start to come together in more complex modern classical-inspired formations. Starting with track 8, subtitled Sarabande, and also including tracks 9 and 11, they start to form much more dissonant harmonies and I guess try to paint with more color and nuance than in a lot of the more simplistically pleasant pieces in the first half. And also not really trying to end with as much of a sense of resolution, perhaps as symbolism for how Sakamoto feels like his life could end at any moment. There's also track 10, which kind of returns to that more meandering lack of structure and filters itself to sound markedly more distant than the more intimate pieces surrounding it. And finally track 12, which is no more than a minute of twinkling bell textures. And I guess that's it. That's literally everything there is to the album. And that does leave me at a bit of a quandary for how to actually judge this thing. In one breath, I'd be lying if I said this was the most consistently engaging work Sakamoto's put out. In the grander scheme of ambient and modern classical music of this particular style, albums that sound exactly like this are almost pretty much the norm, and if this were composed by any random artist I never heard of with all that context removed, I still would have generally liked it, but it wouldn't have really stood out to me. Compare that to Async, which felt like it was going out of the box a lot more and trying a lot more ideas while also exploring a lot of the same themes of mortality. That album got to me way more than this one did while also feeling a lot more unique. But Sakamoto was also in a physically healthier condition for that album, and said themes of mortality don't feel quite as immediate and obviously present as they do on this album. This is an album that shows Sakamoto directly chronicling the coming end of his own life in as starkly realistic a way as he can. Not trying to present himself in a flattering light, but instead trying to demonstrate the fragility of life itself, while also highlighting that he is still alive and willing to create new art even in the face of that coming end. And I don't know how one is even supposed to judge something like that. I mean, I'm probably not going to be hanging on to this album, and I don't see it sticking with me as like a big favorite of the year, but I cannot deny the power it does have and how poignant and meaningful it is, all the deep emotional power it does hold despite how understated and simplistic it all is. And I also don't mean to undersell how genuinely soothing a listen this is. I mean, it was designed as a means of personal comfort for a cancer patient, so obviously if it's going to work well for him, it's going to work well for any other ambient fans. And, you know, it may not get there in all that original way, but not like originality was something that Sakamoto really needed to focus on in either his current situation or at this current point in his life to begin with. So, you know, say what I will about this album, it is exceptionally good at what it's actually trying to accomplish. And whether or not this ends up being Sakamoto's final album, which I kind of suspect he designed it in such a way where he'd feel at peace if it was, he's had the luxury to artistically go out on his own terms. And there's always going to be something special about that, so yeah. I think I can overall give this a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.